The truth is often stranger than fiction, and most times more fun to listen to. You want a good story? Stories about real people. Heroes, villains, survivors, entertainers, and innovators. And some of them are true. We'll hear who made history using their brains, strength, and sometimes a bit of cunning. Everyone has a story. This is episode number 3, The Man with a Silly Vision. Every time I go to Office Depot these days, I'm always amazed at the huge displays of Elmer's glue. When we were kids, at the start of the school year, everyone got one of those little 4-ounce bottles, and that would get you through the year. Now it comes in gallon-sized jugs. Who uses that much glue? Well, it turns out that the primary consumers of all this Elmer's glue are 10 to 12-year-old girls. They mix it with another 100-year-old product, borax, and make slime, all different kinds. They're pretty creative. Different colors, textures, scents, and add-ins like glitter and beads. To find out more, I asked a slime expert for the inside story. 12-year-old Shaden Shandy of Folsom, California was happy to oblige. She says, "I like making slime because it's like science. The best part about playing with slime is stretching it. If you listen for the pops and clicks, it can be very satisfying. My favorite thing about slime is, depending on how you make it, it can be very pretty. My favorite color of slime is holographic. I like showing my friends and trading with them. You can also sell them for a surprisingly high amount of money. The best place to sell slime is on Etsy." So there you go. Some kids are selling their slime online, and they're banking thousands of dollars doing it. Well, these budding entrepreneurs aren't the only ones profiting. Newell Brands, the makers of Elmer's glue, is riding the wave of the slime craze. Elmer's glue has become so popular that at times there have been glue shortages in places around the country. All this reminds me of another wacky flubber-like invention that was nearly accidental. The story begins during the early part of World War II. Japanese forces occupied many of the rubber-producing areas of Southeast Asia. Consequently, there was a shortage of the natural materials needed to produce tires, rafts, and boots, as well as vehicle and aircraft parts. In the United States, all rubber products were rationed, and the General Electric Lab in New Haven, Connecticut was put under government contract to develop an inexpensive synthetic rubber substitute. That's where James Wright, a GE engineer, entered the picture. Wright ultimately failed in his attempts to produce a viable synthetic alternative to rubber, but that's not to say that his efforts proved fruitless. In fact, it was one such failed attempt in 1943 that produced his masterpiece, a mixture of boric acid and silicone oil. It resulted in a gooey, bouncy material with some unique properties. This substance could stretch farther than regular rubber, even at extreme temperatures. It was non-toxic and wouldn't get moldy. However, the synthetic substitute didn't have all the right properties needed to replace rubber. But when the frustrated scientist dropped it, he did find it performed a curious feat of ricocheting off the laboratory floor and returning to its creator's side. And that's where it quietly stuck around for some years to follow. The fellows at the lab did have a lot of fun with the peculiar substance. It could be bounced like a rubber ball or sculpted like a soft piece of clay. They discovered it could be flattened on a newspaper or comic book. The ink would stick and lift perfect copies of printed pages that could be stretched like taffy and distorted for amusement. GE even had contests throughout the company to see if anyone could come up with a good use for the stuff, but no practical purpose ever surfaced. It seemed that even the best scientists in the world couldn't come up with a good use for it. The war ended, and Wright's fascinating flop was all but forgotten. Fast forward to 1949. Another engineer from GE was attending a party. Coming straight from work, he happened to have a blob of the unusual substance with him. For laughs, he began passing it around and showing some of its fascinating characteristics. Somehow, the interesting stuff landed in the hands of Ruth, a local toy store owner. That's where an idea was born. Ruth was working with a fella named Peter on creating a holiday catalog. Peter was an advertising consultant, a tall gentleman with a close-cropped gray beard, sort of like a sea captain. Peter suggested they include the stuff as a novelty item in Ruth's catalog, just on the chance they might sell some. Surprisingly, it retailed better than almost everything else, second only to boxes of Crayola crayons. Ruth continued stocking the product in her store. Although it sold well, she had no personal interest in manufacturing and marketing it. But Peter recognized a good opportunity. Everybody kept saying there was no earthly use for this stuff, he reflected, but I watched them as they fooled with it. I couldn't help noticing how people with busy schedules wasted as much as 15 minutes at a shot, just fondling and stretching it. Peter hatched a plan to literally get this funny substance into the hands of every child in America. With $147 of borrowed money, he bought some of the material and made an agreement with GE for production rights. Then he hurried to get some trademarks recorded. With his last few dollars, he hired a college student to separate the stuff into 1-ounce balls and package it in small plastic eggs before Easter of 1950. Finally, Peter took his product to the New York Toy Fair, where it got little attention, except that he managed to convince Doubleday bookstores to stock it. They were $1 an egg, and at first, they weren't selling much. Peter got his big break when a writer from the New Yorker went to pick up a book at one of the Doubleday outlets in Manhattan. While there, he noticed the display of plastic eggs. He was so intrigued that he wrote about the strange properties of this novelty product in a short story that appeared in the publication on August 26, 1950. Within 3 days, Peter sold 250,000 eggs, and more orders were coming. By the mid-1950s, Peter had contracted Arnold Clark Incorporated to handle bulk manufacturing and distribution. It turned out that the biggest users were children aged 6 to 12, so in 1957, the product began appearing in televised commercials strategically aired during The Howdy Doody Show and Captain Kangaroo. Peter was an ambitious marketing man and aspired to bring his product to the whole world. He succeeded in distributing it in 22 countries. In 1961, despite the Cold War, Peter traveled to Europe and the Soviet Union. The Soviets thought he was an illusionist until he let people handle the stuff. But it wasn't the peculiar characteristics that amazed them most. It was the fact that it was produced at all. They were fascinated that something that was utterly useless was being manufactured in America. Even so, that didn't keep them from selling a bunch of it in the Soviet Union. Well, by now, you probably know we're talking about silly putty. Since 1950, more than 300 million eggs of silly putty have been sold. Benny and Smith, the makers of Crayola products, eventually acquired the rights to silly putty. Ironically, Crayola crayons had been the only product to outsell silly putty in Ruth's 1949 catalog. Today, the name silly putty is a trademark of Crayola LLC, and a name still recognized in most American households. From a factory in Easton, Pennsylvania, they still turn out about 600 pounds of silly putty every day. When he died in 1976 at age 64, Peter Hodgson left an estate of $140 million by creating a market for a silly product he didn't invent. That's his story. Glad you took the time to listen. Wouldn't want you to miss out on a good story. Whether you're entertained or maybe even learned a little something, it's great. Either way. It's even greater when you share these stories with friends and family, especially your kids. If you like the story, don't be shy. Let me know. You can give it a thumbs up on YouTube, iTunes, or wherever you listen. Add it to your favorites so you can get the newest episodes whenever they're released. You're listening to the Everyone Has a Story podcast, a production of realmedia.us. I'm Rodney Powell. Maybe you feel like you have a story to tell for your business, but don't exactly have the right voice to tell it. Let me help you with that. Professional voiceover can bring your story to life and have everyone listening carefully to every word. Feel free to contact me if you want to know more. In the meantime, we'll meet right back here for our next episode because everyone has a story.